Evening. So first reading is from Amos 5, verses 21 to 23. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship's offering, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Isaiah 32, verses 14 to 18, and 35, verses 1 to 6. The fortress will be abandoned, the noisy city deserted. Citadel and watchtower will become a wasteland forever, the delight of donkeys, a pasture for flocks, until the Spirit is poured on us from on high, and the desert becomes a fertile field, and the fertile field seems like a forest. The Lord's justice will dwell in the desert, his righteousness live in the fertile field. The fruit of that righteousness will be peace. Its effect will be quietness and confidence forever. My people will live in peaceful dwelling places, in secure homes, in undisturbed places of rest. The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord and the splendor of our God. Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give away. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. This is the word of the Lord.
Really powerful passage that. It feels particularly fitting to have it this evening, because this evening is the third and final part in our series on creation care. And I'm going to be speaking about justice. And that passage is so striking that as it talks about what it means, what it looks like for God's Spirit to be poured out, for God's presence, if you like, for God's kingdom to more fully come, the image that Isaiah uses is of creation flourishing, of the desert and the parched land bursting into forests and fields, the crocus blooming. And so part of what I want to talk about tonight is the effect of what it means when God's Spirit is poured out. And a word that kept on cropping up in those readings was justice. And what I'm speaking about this evening is creation care as justice. In previous weeks, Rachel, you may remember, spoke about, actually you didn't hear Rachel, did you? But you heard Rachel last week talking about Jesus being the creator, the sustainer, the savior of creation and of creation. Jyoti spoke the previous week. Those of you who watched online would have heard Jez speaking about the new heavens and the new earth. We're building a picture of what it means to long for God's kingdom to come more fully, for creation to become alive in the way that it's meant to. But what I want to look at this evening is to look at this concept of justice. What does it really mean in the Old Testament? And then look to see from that perspective at the injustice that we see in our world and environmental destruction as a core aspect of that. And then I want to ask, how can we respond? What can we do to collaborate with God's Spirit to bring the kind of healing that our land needs? So first of all, to tackle biblical justice, in that Amos passage that we read at the start, Amos uses very strong language about hating the religious meetings and the music of God's people. And it seems that reading into the context, what had been happening is that those people had been compartmentalizing their faith. They had been worshipping with their lips and attending the right meetings, but they had been neglecting justice. They hadn't engaged their worship, hadn't expressed their worship through their lifestyles. And so Amos calls them, no, let justice roll on like a river. Now, what is this biblical concept of justice? It's not as associated as our concept today. You might, when I say justice to you, you might think of something happening in the law courts. No, the biblical concept of justice is much more to do with treating people equitably on a day-to-day basis. And when you look in the Old Testament of how the word justice, mishpat in the Hebrew, where it comes up, often it comes up in a context where it's talking about a care and a concern for the widows, the orphans, the immigrant, the poor, those who are the most vulnerable in ancient society. And if you understand that, then you understand something of the continuity that we then see in Jesus' message, standing connected with that prophetic tradition that calls people to seek justice through their worship. When Jesus describes the most important commandment is to love God and to love your neighbor. Do you see that basic idea of God saying, no, the way I want you to worship me is partly through the way you treat other people. And then, of course, Jesus told stories showing what that love for your neighbor meant, particularly in relation to vulnerable people. So where do we see injustice in our land? Because injustice, if you like, the flip side of caring for the vulnerable is ignoring the cry of the vulnerable. Where do we see that? And clearly a key area we see it and where the media has been very helpful and David Attenborough's been very helpful. Many people have been very helpful in helping us see, both in the church and outside the church, that the way we're exploiting the environment is profoundly unjust for those particularly in the global south who are affected by it. Now, the good news is that we now know more than we've ever known about how through collective action we might be able to reverse some of this climate change. That's good news, not just for us and our children and our children's children, but it's good news for those who are most vulnerable in this global community in which we live, particularly those who are dependent on agriculture, who are perhaps least able to adapt, to be resilient in the face of adversity. And I want to show now a brief clip from a video where the climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe is speaking about this particular effect that climate change is having on those who are most vulnerable in the world today.
So why does climate change matter? It matters precisely because it disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable in the world. If we have a flood in a rich country, it can be devastating. It can produce very expensive damages. But if they have a flood in a developing country, as occurred, for example, 2.5 years ago in Bangladesh during the monsoon season, where due to the abnormally heavy rains, a third of the entire country was underwater, the impacts can be beyond belief. All across the world, since the 1960s, it's estimated that the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries has already increased by 25% due to the impacts of a changing climate. And this past year, the United Nations warned that climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of development, global health, and poverty reduction. We care about climate change because it is a threat multiplier. Climate change is not only an environmental issue. Climate change is a poverty issue. It's a hunger issue. It's an issue of inequality and injustice. Climate change is a human issue, and that's why we care.
So that's a short clip from a film that Tear Fund have put together. We've been encouraging life groups to watch it in a life group. So if you're part of a life group, do encourage your leader to show it to you, or join a life group. Maybe it's still time to discuss some of the material in that video. But there's another aspect to the injustice of climate change that I want to bring up, in addition to that economic justice that Catherine spoke about. Because one of the things that researchers are finding is that climate change is exacerbating some of the gender injustice that we see particularly in the global south. And this is partly because in traditional societies, when there's food scarcity, it often seems to be women and girls who find that men and boys are prioritized before them when it comes to food. In traditional societies, it's often seen as the role of women and girls to go and collect water. So if a stream dries up, then they have to go that much further to collect water from that stream, piling the work on, putting them perhaps at risk of domestic violence if they're unable to find the food and the water to sustain life. I think such graphic pictures from Isaiah, when Isaiah in these passages were talking about the desert and the parched land, I think he was well familiar with the kind of poverty that drought can bring about. And then also, if we think about the countries that are particularly affected by climate change in the global south, then we recognize there can actually be a very racial dimension to this injustice and inequality that we have of wealthy white countries often exploiting the resources that have such impacts on those in poorer countries, more dependent on agriculture. So if we're serious about tackling injustice, climate change is a point of massive leverage where we can act, with that potential to have an influence over gender injustice and racial injustice and economic injustice. If we can work to seek to reverse climate change, to allow creation to flourish. And I want to talk about some other areas too that might be less obvious, where we can make a difference to climate change. And some of these I've mentioned just because they're very topical and close to home. I think one key issue is very close to us, and that's to do with the clothes that we wear. The availability of cheap clothing has caused us to buy so much more clothing than we did before. Apparently, the average person buys 60% more items of clothing than they did 15 years ago, and that clothing is kept only half as long. That consumption of clothing is actually having devastating effects on the environment, particularly when the related cotton isn't farmed organically. But what's even more shocking is when you begin to ask the question, well, why is this clothing so much cheaper than it was? The Financial Times last year published an article, and it was entitled, "Forced Labor is the Price of a Cheap Cotton T-shirt." And the article went on to explain that something like 20% of the world's cotton could easily be tainted with forced labor somewhere in the supply chain. I'm horrified by the idea that so many of the clothes I own might have been the product of forced labor, of injustice. Maybe we can show the Jeremiah verse, where we see that actually kind of using forced labor, this is something that a king did, that Jeremiah is critiquing him. This is given as a particular example of injustice that we might unwittingly be part of. If we just conform to the easiest way, the most convenient way of buying clothes, then we could unwittingly end up perpetuating the systemic injustice we see in our fashion industry. But the good news is that perhaps in part thanks to the internet and so much research that's gone on, it's actually really easy now to find out more information about the sources of the clothing we purchase. If you Google ethical clothing, ethical sportswear, ethical shoes, you'll find masses of stuff comes up on the internet. Ethical Consumers, another great website that's there to see. We have options, we have opportunities to choose, to open our eyes, if you like, to the injustices that can be so close to our skin. I think another area where we can have a real effect on the environment is through the way we invest money. Now, I know some of you might feel, that's fine because I really don't have any investments. But if you're beginning work, you'll often be given an opportunity, often very in your first job, to invest a pension. And where you have influence on that is often to choose an ethical option. If we don't choose any kind of moral criteria, if you like, over investments, if we just go for the most convenient, the easiest thing, then we can end up unwittingly perhaps funding arms sales to oppressive regimes, perhaps fueling some of the conflicts we're reading about in our newspapers today, brutal conflicts where innocent civilians are being killed, and dissension and famine has been caused as a result of civil wars. If we just conform to the system of the easiest way to invest money, if we don't choose to be engaged in thinking about what we're investing in, then we're at risk of perpetuating that injustice. But again, the good news is that it's actually become so much easier now to choose to invest ethically. It can be as simple as maybe typing into Google ethical investment fund, and you'll see kind of various league tables and opportunities where someone can manage money with an ethical criteria. So I've spoken about climate change and the opportunities that we have, particularly through thinking about consumption of clothes and investments that we can do to change that, besides all the lifestyle issues that we know about. But the question is, how will we respond to this opportunity that we have? Because we can respond by choosing not to open our eyes. Goodness knows we've all got a lot going on in our minds. It would be quite understandable for you to say, Hugo, I just don't have the headspace to think about this. Isn't it someone else's job anyway to fix these kind of problems? Don't we elect politicians to deal with these big systemic issues? I just need to focus on my stuff for now. And I think actually that's part of the issue that Jesus was addressing when he told that parable of the Good Samaritan. Do you remember the story? The Levite and the priest were walking along the road and they saw an injured traveler lying by the side of the road. And the text says that they chose to cross over to the other side. They passed by on the other side. In other words, they chose not to look. They probably felt it wasn't their job to care for a stranger, and they went on to do what was their job, I guess, which was to lead worship for the people of Israel. And then Jesus subverts the racial stereotyping of the day by then telling the story about the Good Samaritan who comes along and he sees the wounded traveler lying by the side. He's a stranger. He doesn't know who this traveler is. But he sees and then responds and shows compassion, showing that mishpat, that Old Testament concept of justice, of caring for the vulnerable. We have the freedom, clearly, to cross by to the other side of the road, to not engage in justice issues. But that falls short of the vision that God has for his people to be part of renewing this world. We could respond to the multiple issues I've raised by just feeling overwhelmed and anxious, by kind of going into a place of sort of apathy and inaction because there's just too much to do. But that wouldn't be worthy of a people of the resurrection. That wouldn't be worthy of a people who are filled and anointed by God's Spirit, equipped for mission, anointed to bring good news to the poorest of the earth. Or we have a third choice, to be people who persevere in prayer and action, persevere in prayer for an outpouring of God's Spirit to quite literally heal creation, and persevere in action, in persevering as we participate in seeking justice as that vital aspect of worship that God calls us to do. And if we want to do that, if you want to engage in that pursuit of justice, I want to suggest 2 tips for how to do that effectively. The first is I'm calling open your eyes. We've devised systems as a world to hide us from the unpleasantness of looking at injustice. But if you're determined to see, if you're willing to give it the headspace, to do the research, to Google before you buy that next item of clothing, then you can begin to see. Seeing, some theologians write, is actually a core part of what discipleship really means. And if we learn to see, then I think we will begin to see many, many opportunities that we have to seek God's justice in this world, to begin to see the transformation. That, of course, is our vision as a church, not to grow big and to grow wealthy, but to love God, to grow disciples, and then to transform communities. Because we know that if disciples see things as they are, then they will want to bring that healing and transformation to rectify the injustice, the desert land that surrounds us. Now, transformation is a grand word, but it's made up of lots of little steps, lots of little actions. And that brings me on to my next point besides open your eyes, and that's recognize the power of small things. I've raised lots of issues. It can be overwhelming to try and to sort all of them at one time, but what we can do is maybe choose one issue, have that as something that we act on, as one lifestyle change, and then maybe move on to the next. It might be as simple as when you go to someone's house, maybe buying them some fair trade chocolate. Who knows, it might inspire a conversation about fair trade or prompt them to buy some fair trade chocolate or coffee later. As consumers, if we act collectively, we can then begin to change the way retailers operate. If we change the way retailers operate, then we begin to affect these supply chains. Sometimes we can do that through consuming. Other times there'll be a role for campaigning to bring about the kind of changes we've been talking about. I remember in the 1990s being part of a really fun campaign to try and get fairly traded produce stocked on supermarket shelves. And we gathered together supermarket till receipts from our church. Churches all over the country were doing this, and we stapled these till receipts together into large chains. I remember that process of stapling one small chain at a time. But it then meant we had these enormous chains to present to supermarket chief executives as part of a big campaign event. It's the reason, because of all those people sitting in churches across the country, stapling together till receipts, that's the reason why you can buy fairly traded produce today in many supermarkets. Journeys of transformation involve lots of little steps. We have a great service here on Thursday mornings called By Still Waters, and we often try and create a space for people to share prophetic words during that time. And as we were worshiping this Thursday, we had been talking about rebuilding the temple. And someone had a picture of what a finished temple looks like. And they noted that the most intricate bits, the most detailed bits, were actually the most beautiful, the most key to creating that atmosphere. And we felt it was a word of encouragement to some who felt things were moving slowly but painstakingly. That when we look back, it's often the finest detail that leads to that intricate beauty. I think it can be like that sometimes, working for justice. Sometimes it can feel like we're making very slow progress. But in the eyes of God, that can be the intricate part of our worship. So I've spoken how we've hidden our faces from recognizing injustice in our world. But the scriptures, in contrast to the severity of climate change, are full of hope, of the transformative work that God's Spirit brings, full of that call, as we've been discussing, to express our worship through seeking mishpat, justice. That's characterized by a concern for the vulnerable. That's characterized by loving our global neighbor. And Isaiah, when he writes of what it looks like when God's Spirit is being poured out, talks not just about creation flourishing, but do you remember those words? Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the mute tongue shout for joy. Let's be people with open eyes, open ears, ready to speak out on justice issues, that we might see justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream to bring healing to our land. Those were the scriptures I wanted to talk about, but now I'd just love to give you a sense of what this means in practice, if you like, how we walk this out with legs. So I've asked Fiona to come and be interviewed by me. She didn't particularly want to be interviewed. She doesn't think of herself as an eco-warrior, but I encouraged her. I'm trying to make this point, I said, of small steps leading to transformation. So please, would you come and be interviewed? Can we give her a round of applause? Fiona, thanks so much for coming here, and your family are here with you, which is great. We know each other because you cook for the Drop-In, which is our weekly community meal for the vulnerable and the homeless. I know you make great soups and great main courses. So you're interested in food. How has thinking about creation care and the environment affected the way you think about food?
Yeah, I have done quite a bit of thought around this, and moving to this country, realised that I got really, really stressed out, because even more so than in Australia, like, packaging is a major issue in the supermarket. It just stresses me out not being able to buy like a lettuce that's not wrapped in plastic and stuff like that. So, packaging, food miles, that's another thing that I think about a lot, and also just eating sustainably. So in my family, we've really cut down quite dramatically on the amount of red meat that we eat. I tend not to eat it at all, but, it's not the most popular decision in the family, and, there's been a bit of dissension, but I think everyone's coming on board now, so that's really great. Right. Yeah.
Well, and for your work, I know you're a creative, you design things. Do you want to talk about how your thinking on the environment has affected the way you work?
Yeah, so a few years ago, I started looking into Beeswax Wraps, which are an alternative to plastic wrapping, and I figured out how to make those through lots of YouTube kind of clips and things like that. Made a recipe that I was really happy with, and I started selling those. I don't sell them anymore, but I'm really happy to share recipes and that kind of thing. So if anyone would like that, then just ask me and I'll send it to you. But at the moment, I'm making a lot of ceramics, and a lot of my thought around ceramics, it's a high energy kind of, a high use of electricity basically that goes into ceramics. So I like to keep the footprint as low as I possibly can. I've tried to make small, and I make soap dishes to replace plastic soap pumps, for example, in the bathroom.
Great. So people just can buy a bar of soap instead and put it on the dish, which is better than the plastic.
Yeah, and some bars of soap you can buy that aren't even wrapped in paper. You can just buy them raw. So that's so that's a huge kind of help in the bathroom. They're all small things, but I'm also now developing a little coffee filter that, you put the paper filter in, and instead of buying a massive coffee machine with the little disposable cups that go into landfill, you can just use like this filter. And actually you can do that with fabric as well that you can reuse. So that's in development at the moment.
Great. I look forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
And why, just one final question, why for you Do you think it's so important to care for the environment?
As a Christian, I think it's a no-brainer. I think it's imperative because the earth was given to us to maintain as a gift from God. He says in Genesis, I give you the earth, I give mankind the earth and everything in it, and the beasts and whatever. And that was on day 6. So, I guess I take it from there. But there's so many examples in the Bible where we're asked to care and we're asked to, we're instructed on how that should be done. So...
And I know you were saying earlier you're someone who really appreciates creation.
Yeah, and I think that the beauty in creation is our restoration, isn't it? Like how often through COVID particularly have we, spent some time outside just like breathing fresh air and walking through a forest or something like that. It's restorative and it's a gift from God. And if we don't have that anymore, then we don't get to enjoy that gift. So I think it's really great. It's a no-brainer.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Fiona. Can we give it? Yeah.